The night did not arrive gently. It fell like a heavy curtain over the forest, swallowing the last trace of color from the sky until everything became a shade of black, layered over deeper black. And into that darkness 5 men stepped with laughter still clinging to their mouths as if the world owed them amusement. They came in a truck that growled its way down a dirt road and died at the edge of the trees, headlights cutting 2 pale tunnels through the brush before snapping off, leaving the woods to reclaim itself. The air smelled of wet soil and old leaves, a thick, breathing scent that made the chest feel tight. But none of the men noticed or cared, their boots crunching loudly as if noise itself were a declaration of ownership. They were confident in the way men are confident when they believe numbers and strength make them untouchable, when the night feels like a playground instead of a warning, and when cruelty has been rehearsed so many times in jokes and half-spoken threats that it no longer feels like a choice. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a branch snapped, sharp and sudden, and a figure moved between the trees, small and fast, her breath tearing at her lungs as she ran without direction, without plan, guided only by the animal instinct to put distance between herself and the sound of voices calling out behind her. Her feet struck roots and stones, pain flashing white up her legs, but she did not slow, because slowing meant hands, and hands meant the end of everything she was trying to protect. The men heard her movement, and it excited them, the way predators respond to rustling grass, and one of them laughed loudly, the sound cracking through the night like a gunshot, announcing to the forest that the game had begun. They spread out instinctively, not because they were skilled hunters, but because cruelty teaches its own tactics. 2 moving left, 2 right, 1 straight ahead, voices calling, mocking, promising nothing good, their words slurring together into something less than language and more like noise meant to terrify. The girl stumbled into a clearing where moonlight filtered through the canopy in broken pieces, illuminating her face for a split second. Sweat and dirt streaked across her skin, eyes wide with a terror so raw it felt like it might break free of her body and run on its own, and that glimpse was enough to confirm to the men that she was real, that this was happening, that the chase was not imagined. One of them whistled low and long, a sound that carried too far, and another shouted something crude that echoed back distorted, the forest bending his words until even he did not recognize them. She darted past a fallen log and into thicker undergrowth, branches clawing at her arms and hair, ripping threads from her clothes, leaving behind pieces of her as offerings to the woods. But she did not stop to feel it, because fear does not allow inventory, it only allows motion. Behind her, the men cursed as thorns snagged at their jackets and pants, irritation flickering briefly before being swallowed again by the thrill of pursuit, because frustration fed their anger, and anger fed the chase. They talked to each other as they moved, not about where they were or how dangerous the terrain was becoming, but about her, reducing her to something hunted, something already claimed in their minds, and with every word they spoke the forest seemed to lean closer, branches creaking, leaves whispering as if listening. The girl's lungs burned, each breath shallow and sharp, and she tasted blood where she had bitten her lip to keep from screaming when a root sent her. Sprawling forward, her palms slamming into damp earth, mud coating her skin cold and slick. For one terrifying second, she thought it was over, that they would be on her before she could even push herself up. But the forest offered a narrow mercy as she rolled down a slight embankment into a patch of ferns that swallowed her shape, and she lay there frozen, heart hammering so loudly she was sure it could be heard. Footsteps thundered past, close enough that she could see boots, smell sweat and cheap alcohol, hear the roughness of their breathing, and she pressed her face into the dirt, willing herself to become soil, to be anything but a girl being hunted. The men slowed when they lost her trail, confusion creeping into their voices as they argued over which direction she had gone, their certainty cracking just enough to let unease seep in, but not enough to stop them. One of them shined a flashlight in a wide arc, the beam cutting through the dark and skimming over tree trunks and low branches, and when it passed over the ferns, the girl closed her eyes, expecting exposure, but the light moved on, distracted by movement elsewhere, and she did not know whether to thank luck or the forest itself. She crawled backward inch by inch until her muscles screamed, then rose and ran again, deeper now, away from the road, away from anything familiar, choosing darkness over certainty, because certainty meant capture. The men regrouped, annoyed now, voices sharper, laughter gone, replaced by the brittle edge of impatience, and one of them kicked a rock hard enough that it skittered away into the brush, the sound echoing strangely as if multiplied. They decided to press on because turning back felt like weakness, and weakness was not something any of them believed applied to them, not tonight, not ever. As they moved farther into the forest, the air seemed to change, growing heavier, cooler, carrying with it a low hum that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely, and the ground beneath their feet grew uneven, roots rising like bones from the earth, forcing them to watch where they stepped. The girl's sense of direction dissolved completely, the forest twisting around her until every tree looked the same, but with the loss of direction came something else, a strange clarity, a feeling that she was no longer alone in her fear, that the woods were not just an obstacle but a presence, ancient and patient. She remembered stories whispered by elders about places that watched, places that remembered, places that did not forget what was done beneath their branches. And as another shout rang out behind her, closer this time, she felt a flicker of something beneath the terror, something like resolve, like a thread pulling her forward, not just away. The men, unaware of the shift, pushed harder, their breaths ragged now, sweat cooling on their skin, irritation giving way to a low-grade anxiety they would never admit to each other. Because the forest was too quiet, because the echoes did not behave as they should, because the darkness felt thicker than night had any right to be. Still they continued, driven by the momentum of their own cruelty, by the belief that this night belonged to them, that the girl running ahead was already theirs in every way that mattered. Above them, clouds slid across the moon, smothering what little light remained, and in that deepening darkness, the first true mistake was made, a step taken too fast, a branch broken in the wrong direction, a choice that felt small and would later be understood as the moment everything began to turn, though none of them could see it yet. The hunt was fully underway now, not just a pursuit but a commitment, a crossing of an invisible line, and as the girl vanished once more, into the black heart of the woods, the forest seemed to close behind her, swallowing sound, swallowing light, swallowing the certainty that the men had carried in with them, leaving only the night, the chase, and the quiet sense that something older than all of them had begun to pay attention. The deeper they went, the less the forest resembled a place they recognized, as if each step forward erased the last trace of the world they believed they knew, the ground softening beneath their boots, swallowing sound, swallowing certainty, until even their own breathing felt chuzhed to them. The men slowed without meaning to, their bodies reacting before their minds could, because the woods had grown unnaturally still, not the peaceful quiet of night, but a hollow absence where even insects seemed to hold their breath. The girl's footsteps had vanished again, her presence reduced to a memory that tugged them forward, and it was that absence that unsettled them most, the way prey could disappear so completely. One of them muttered that she was playing tricks, another said the forest was messing with their heads, and they laughed weakly, the sound thin and brittle, shattering almost as soon as it left their mouths. A branch creaked somewhere high above, slow and deliberate, and all five looked up at once, flashlights sweeping the canopy, beams slicing through layers of leaves and shadow, finding nothing and somehow making the darkness feel heavier for it. They pressed on anyway, because stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant confronting the strange pressure building in their chests, the sense that they were being funneled rather than chasing freely. The ground sloped downward into a shallow ravine, damp and slick with moss, and as they descended, their boots left deeper impressions, as if the earth itself were reluctant to let them pass without marking them. The girl had crow, said here too, her footprints faint but visible where mud had clung to her heels, and the sight of them reignited the men's focus, anger flaring to cover the unease, because proof of her struggle made the hunt feel real again. They followed the prints until they reached a narrow stream, its water black and slow-moving, reflecting no stars, and here the trail dissolved completely, footprints swallowed by water and stone. One of the men cursed loudly, the word bouncing back wrong, stretched and warped, and he glanced over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone standing there, though no one was. The forest did not echo like this, he thought. Not normally, but he kept the thought to himself. They split again, circling the stream, flashlights jittering as hands began to shake despite their efforts to appear steady, and it was then that the forest seemed to lean in closer, branches swaying though there was no wind, leaves whispering in a language that hovered just beyond understanding. Somewhere ahead, something moved, not fast like the girl had, but slow and deliberate, a shifting weight that suggested purpose, and one of the men froze, lifting his hand instinctively to signal the others to stop. For a moment they stood like statues, listening, hearts thudding so loudly it felt impossible that the sound did not give them away, and then the movement stopped, replaced by silence so complete it rang in their ears. The girl crouched behind a cluster of rocks not far away, her body trembling as she fought to control her breath, the cold seeping into her bones from the damp ground, and she sensed the change too. The way the forest had thickened around her, the way the air felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. She had crossed the stream without thinking, driven by instinct, and now she realized she had crossed something else as well, an invisible boundary marked "not be." Signs or fences, but by a deep, resonant feeling in her chest, as if she had stepped into a place that did not belong to anyone living. She remembered the stories again, the warnings about wandering too far, about woods that did not like being used as playgrounds for cruelty, and for the first time since the chase began, she did not feel entirely alone. The men resumed their movement cautiously, their earlier swagger gone, replaced by clipped commands and sharp glances, because the forest had begun to rearrange itself in subtle ways, paths curving where they should have been straight, familiar shapes appearing distorted, tree trunks seeming closer together than before. One of them was certain they had passed the same twisted oak twice, though no one admitted it out loud, because admitting it would mean acknowledging that they might be lost. Their flashlights flickered, not all at once but one by one, brief stutters of darkness that made their stomachs drop, and each time the light returned, the shadows seemed deeper, more crowded. The girl moved when she could, staying low, using the uneven ground to hide her shape, her muscles screaming in protest as exhaustion crept in, but she pushed through it because fear sharpened her senses now instead of overwhelming them. She noticed how the forest offered narrow passages, how fallen logs created barriers that slowed pursuit, how dense thickets opened just enough for her smaller frame to slip through, and it felt less like luck and more like guidance. Behind her, the men grew louder again, anger rising to fill the space left by fear, their voices harsh as they argued about directions, about who should have watched which side, about why this was taking so long. One of them stumbled and fell hard, his shout of pain slicing through the night, and when the others rushed to help him up, there was a moment of shared vulnerability. A moment where all five stood close together, breathing hard, and in that moment something passed between them, unspoken but understood, the realization that the forest was no longer just scenery. They moved on, but the rhythm of their steps was off now, no longer unified, each man slightly out of sync with the others, and the forest seemed to exploit that disunity, sounds drawing them apart, faint rustles to the left, soft thuds to the right, whispers that might have been wind or might have been voices just beyond the edge of hearing. The girl paused again, pressing her back against a tree whose bark felt warm despite the cold air, and she closed her eyes briefly, letting the terror wash through her instead of fighting it, because fighting had drained her, and she needed clarity more than strength. In that stillness, she felt it, a low vibration under her skin, like the forest breathing, like roots shifting deep underground, and when she opened her eyes, the darkness no longer felt empty. The men crossed into a stand of trees so dense that even their flashlights struggled to penetrate it, beams breaking into fragments against overlapping trunks, and here the silence was complete, oppressive, their own movements sounding muffled, distant. One of them swore he heard a voice say his name, soft and close to his ear, and he spun around, heart racing, only to see nothing but shadow, his companions staring at him with expressions that hovered between mockery and concern. They laughed it off again, because laughter was easier than admitting fear, but it did not last, because the forest responded with a sound that was unmistakably not laughter, a deep, resonant crack that rolled through the trees like thunder without lightning. Somewhere, a tree fell, not crashing but settling, as if laid down deliberately, and the men froze once more, a primal instinct telling them that movement was suddenly dangerous. The girl took that moment to move farther away, slipping into a narrow corridor between boulders that scraped her shoulders and arms, drawing blood she did not stop to feel, because the forest seemed to close ranks behind her, the passage narrowing until it felt like a test, a question being asked. The men debated whether to turn back, the idea surfacing tentatively before being crushed by pride, by the fear of what it would mean to leave without finishing what they started, and so they continued, though now every step felt like trespass. The night grew colder, breath fogging in front of their faces, and with the cold came the sense of being watched, not from one direction but from everywhere at once, as if eyes had opened all around them, patient and unblinking. They did not notice when the forest began to guide them too, subtly steering them apart, encouraging one man to linger a moment longer, another to take a slightly different path, because the changes were small, almost imperceptible, and because their attention remained fixed on the idea of the girl ahead of them. She slowed near a circle of ancient trees whose roots knotted together above ground like massive veins, and here the air felt different again, heavy with age, with memory, and she understood without knowing how that this place remembered things, that it held on to moments and intentions long after people were gone. She did not know what would happen next, only that the forest had not rejected her, that it had opened just enough to let her pass, and as she pressed her hand against the rough bark of one of the trees, grounding herself, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. Behind her the men stepped into the same space, unaware that they were no longer following her trail so much as being drawn into something that had been waiting. And as the shadows deepened and the silence pressed closer, the balance of the night shifted, subtle but irreversible, the hunt no longer moving in only one direction, the forest closing in around them all, patient, watchful and awake. The moment it truly began, none of them could later agree on, because fear fractures memory, bending time until cause and effect blur together, but somewhere in the deep heart of the forest, the chase quietly inverted, and the first sign was not a scream or an attack, but absence. 1 second, all 5 men were moving forward, flashlights bobbing, boots scuffing wet earth, breath steaming in the cold, and the next one of them was simply not there anymore, his light gone, his footsteps cut off as cleanly as a sentence mid-word. The others noticed only after a few steps, when the rhythm of their movement broke, when the sound of breathing counted wrong, and they stopped, turning in a slow circle, calling his name with irritation that quickly sharpened into something edged with panic. There was no reply, not even an echo, and that silence felt heavier than any answer could have been, because the forest had begun to absorb sound completely, swallowing their voices as if they had never existed. One of them laughed nervously, and suggested the missing man was playing a joke, but the laughter died quickly because jokes did not extinguish light, and jokes did not erase presence so completely. They fanned out just a little, flashlights crossing, beams colliding against tree trunks and low branches, and in the shifting patterns of light, the forest seemed to move, shadows stretching and recoiling like living things. Somewhere far off, there was a sound that might have been a footstep or might have been a branch, settling, and one of the men took a step toward it before stopping abruptly, a sudden certainty gripping him that stepping forward, without knowing why, would be a mistake. He would not be able to undo. The girl watched from concealment, her body pressed into a hollow between roots, her breath shallow, every muscle coiled, and she saw the confusion ripple through them like a sickness, saw how their shoulders hunched, how their heads turned too often, how their confidence leaked away with every unanswered call. She did not cheer, did not feel relief yet, because survival had taught her that pauses were dangerous, that this forest was not offering safety so much as demanding stillness, and she obeyed, staying silent even as her legs trembled from exhaustion. The men regrouped tightly now, backs almost touching, because something old in them understood that separation was no longer a choice, and they moved again, slower, more cautious, each step negotiated as if the ground itself might shift beneath them. They argued in whispers about which direction to go, about whether to continue or retreat, but retreat had become a theoretical concept rather than a real option, because none of them could point to the way back, and the trees around them all looked the same, endless repetitions of bark and shadow. Another sound cut through the stillness, closer this time, a sharp crack followed by a low, almost human groan, and one of the men spun toward it, heart slamming, flashlight beam shaking as it carved a frantic arc through the darkness. The beam landed on something pale and unmoving near the base of a tree, and for a split second his mind refused to interpret it, because denial is faster than comprehension, but when he stepped closer, the shape resolved into an arm, fingers curled awkwardly into the mud, and he recoiled with a shout that tore free before he could stop it. The others rushed forward, horror spreading across their faces as they saw what remained of their companion, his body twisted in a way that suggested a fall that should not have been possible, his eyes open and unseeing, reflecting nothing, as if the forest had already claimed them. Panic erupted then, raw and uncontrolled, voices overlapping, hands shaking, one man gagging as he turned away, another swearing over and over as if words could reverse what they were seeing. They did not notice how the forest leaned closer in that moment, how the darkness thickened at the edges of their vision, how the trees seemed to close ranks, because shock narrows focus, trapping the mind in a tight, blinding circle. The girl closed her eyes briefly, pain and sorrow threading through her fear, because death, even deserved death, carries weight, and she felt the forest acknowledge that weight, holding it, absorbing it, not celebrating but accepting, as if this was an old pattern being replayed. When the men finally forced themselves to move again, it was not as hunters but as fugitives, their earlier purpose shattered, replaced by a desperate need to escape something they could not name, and in their haste they made mistakes, splitting without realizing it, one man lagging behind, distracted by the fear of leaving another body unaccounted for. He thought he heard someone whisper his name again, soft and coaxing, and turned toward it despite every instinct screaming not to, stepping off the faint path they had carved, and the forest accepted him without struggle, the darkness swallowing his light, his shape dissolving into shadow until he was gone. His scream came seconds later, short and sharp, cut off so abruptly that it felt like a door slamming shut, and the remaining three froze, the sound echoing in their skulls long after it had ended. They did not go after him, because whatever courage they had left curdled into terror at the realization that movement itself seemed to invite attention, and they huddled together, flashlights pointing outward, hands slick. Kay with sweat despite the cold. The girl moved then, guided by an instinct that felt older than thought, slipping through a narrow gap between trees, the forest parting just enough to let her pass, and she felt the ground vibrate faintly beneath her feet, a slow, deliberate pulse, like a heartbeat. The men argued in urgent whispers about which direction to run, about whether to stay together or split up to increase their chances, logic clashing with panic, until the decision was made for them by the forest itself. A sudden crash splitting the night, as a massive branch fell between them, not randomly but with precision, striking the ground hard enough to send a tremor through their bones. One man stumbled back, tripped over an exposed root, and as he scrambled to his feet, something seized his ankle, not violently but firmly, and he screamed as he was dragged backward into the brush, his flashlight bouncing wildly before disappearing, his cries fading into a muffled gurgle that ended too soon. The remaining two stood paralyzed, staring at the place where he had vanished, minds blank, bodies refusing to obey commands that no longer made sense, and in that paralysis the forest tightened its grip, the silence pressing so hard it felt like pressure on their ears. They ran then, not together but in opposite directions, each driven by the selfish, instinctive belief that survival lay anywhere the other was not, and the forest welcomed the separation, guiding one man along a path that narrowed steadily, trees closing in until branches scraped his face and arms, drawing thin lines of blood that glistened briefly in the moonlight. He burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt, because the ground dropped away abruptly at its far edge, revealing a steep descent into darkness, and as he turned to run back, the forest was already behind him, shadows shifting, roots rising, and he fell, his scream echoing as he tumbled out of sight, swallowed by the ravine. The last man ran blindly, lungs burning, tears streaking his face as fear finally stripped away every pretense of dominance, and he did not notice the girl standing still ahead of him until he was almost upon her, her shape emerging from the darkness like a question he did not want to answer. He skidded to a stop, staring at her in disbelief, because she looked different now, not triumphant or monstrous, just steady, grounded, as if the forest itself stood behind her, and for a heartbeat he thought he could still overpower her, that this nightmare might end with familiar violence. Then the forest spoke, not in words but in movement, branches creaking, roots shifting, shadows rising, and he understood with horrifying clarity that she was no longer the one being hunted, that whatever bargain had been struck in blood and fear had already been paid. The girl stepped back, not attacking, not chasing, simply allowing the forest to close the distance, and the man screamed as the darkness surged forward, not tearing but enveloping, pulling him down, pulling him in, until his voice dissolved into the night and the forest settled once more, holding what it had taken. The girl stood alone for a long moment, shaking, tears finally spilling as the adrenaline drained from her body, and around her the woods breathed, slow and deep, the violence ebbing like a tide, leaving behind only silence, memory, and the knowledge that something irreversible had occurred, that the balance had shifted, and that the night would never be remembered the same way again by anyone who survived it. By the time the forest released its grip, just enough for thought to return, the night had changed texture, fear thinning into something heavier and more reflective, like cold settling into bone. The girl moved without running. Ow! Guided by a quiet certainty rather than panic, each step placed with care, as if the ground were listening, as if it mattered how she moved through it. The silence around her was no longer empty but attentive, a vast held breath, and within it she felt the weight of what had happened, pressing in from all sides, not as accusation but as acknowledgement. She did not know how much time had passed, minutes stretching into something elastic and strange, but the forest lightened subtly, not with dawn yet, just with the easing of pure black into layered shadow. Behind her, somewhere deep among the trees, something shifted and settled, the aftershock of violence fading like ripples across dark water. She paused beside a massive trunk whose bark bore old scars, lightning or axes or both, and pressed her palm against it, grounding herself, feeling the warmth there again, that impossible warmth, and she realized the forest was not celebrating, not reveling, but remembering, taking inventory the way ancient places do. The truth of the night began to assemble itself in her mind, not as a sequence of events, but as a pattern, a recognition that what had chased her had awakened something that had always been present, waiting for intention to give it shape. She felt grief then, unexpected and sharp, not only for herself and the terror she had endured, but for the men too, not as individuals but as symbols of a violence so old it had worn grooves into the world. Grief did not undo what they had done, nor did it ask forgiveness on their behalf, but it settled into her chest anyway, heavy and human, and she let it be there without fighting it. The forest seemed to approve of that stillness, branches relaxing, the oppressive pressure easing just enough to allow breath to come easier. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, the sound low and solemn, and it felt like punctuation, the end of a sentence that had been running too long. She moved again, following a faint slope upward, aware now of the terrain in a way she had not been before, noticing how roots formed natural steps, how stones marked stable ground, how the forest offered paths to those who listened. Her body ached, every muscle trembling with the after-effects of adrenaline, and she stumbled once, catching herself on a sapling that bent but did not break, and she whispered a thank you without knowing who she was addressing. The night answered with nothing, which felt like acceptance. Far behind her, the last man who had fled was no longer running, no longer anything the forest would release, and the knowledge of that settled into the space between her breaths, not as triumph but as a closed door. She did not look back. Looking back felt like inviting the past to speak again, and she was not ready for its voice. As she climbed, the forest thinned slightly, trees spacing out, undergrowth less aggressive, and she sensed she was being guided toward an edge, a threshold that marked the limit of what the night would claim. The air grew colder, clearer, and with it came the first faint suggestion of dawn, not light yet, but possibility, a subtle shift that made the darkness feel temporary. She remembered the men's faces in fragments, not clearly, just impressions of mouths twisted by laughter that had curdled into fear, and she felt a surge of anger then, hot and brief, followed by exhaustion so deep it almost brought her to her knees. She leaned against another tree, closing her eyes, and images flickered behind her lids, flashes of running feet, swinging lights, falling bodies, the forest moving with purpose, and she let them pass without clinging to them, understanding instinctively that memory would come later, that survival demanded presence now. The forest murmured, a low susurration of leaves and distant water, and within that sound she sensed an understanding forming, a recognition that the truth of the night was not a single thing but many truths layered together, fear and justice, chance and intention, human cruelty and non-human response. She did not assign names to it because names felt too small, and instead she accepted the complexity, letting it settle into her like sediment. As she moved on, she noticed signs she had missed before, faint markings on stones, the way certain trees bore offerings of twine or cloth, remnants of people who had come here long ago with different intentions, and she realized she was not the first to be carried through this place by necessity. The thought steadied her, connecting her to a long, unbroken line of survival that stretched beyond the reach of any single night. Somewhere ahead, the forest opened into a wider space, a natural corridor where the ground rose gently and the canopy lifted, allowing the sky to show itself in a thin grey band. She stopped there, listening, testing the air, and felt no pressure to move faster, no sense of being watched in the way she had before. The forest had withdrawn its focus, satisfied, and in that withdrawal there was a strange tenderness, a permission to leave. She sat on a fallen log and let herself shake, the delayed release of fear racking her body in waves, tears coming hard and fast, carrying with them the residue of terror and rage and disbelief. She cried for a long time, until her throat burned and her head ached, and the forest did not interrupt, did not judge, simply held the space, the way earth does when it receives rain. When the shaking subsided, she felt lighter, hollowed out but steadier, and she took inventory of herself, the cuts and bruises, the torn clothes, the soreness that would bloom into pain later, and she knew she would survive these too. The truth of the night continued to assemble itself, now less like a storm and more like a map, showing her where lines had been crossed and where they had closed again. She understood that whatever had happened here would not be spoken of easily, that language would fail to capture the way the forest had acted, the way intention had met response, and she accepted that silence would be part of carrying this truth forward. As the sky brightened incrementally, the sounds of morning began to stir at the edges, tentative and cautious, as if the world were checking whether it was safe to resume. Birds called softly one by one, and the forest breathed differently now, no longer coiled but open, and she felt a pull toward the sound, toward the idea of emergence. She stood and began walking again, following the incline until the trees thinned enough that she could see the outline of the road far below, a pale scar cutting through the land. The sight brought a surge of conflicting emotion, relief tangled with dread, because returning to the world meant returning to questions, to disbelief, to the burden of explaining what could not be fully explained. She lingered at the edge, one last glance back into the forest, and in that glance she felt the truth settle finally into a shape she could carry, that the night had not been about revenge alone, nor about innocence preserved or lost, but about balance asserted, about a boundary enforced by a place that had witnessed too much to remain indifferent. She did not bow, did not perform any ritual of thanks, because gratitude felt complicated here, and instead she simply acknowledged the forest with her presence, with the respect of someone who understood she had been allowed passage. As she stepped out of the trees and onto the gravel shoulder, the forest closed behind her quietly, leaves shifting, branches settling, erasing obvious signs of what had transpired, and she felt the finality of that erasure like a seal. The truth would live in her now, in the way she moved through the world, in the way she listened to places, in the way she recognized danger before it announced itself. Dawn edged closer, pale and uncertain, and she stood there, breathing in the cold air, knowing that while the night would end, it would never fully release her, and that perhaps that was the cost of survival, to carry forward a truth that was heavy, necessary, and hers alone to bear. Dawn arrived without ceremony, a thin grey seep through the trees that felt less like light and more like permission. And with it came the sound of someone breathing too hard for morning, a ragged animal noise scraping against the quiet as the last man crawled from the forest on hands and knees. He did not stand at first because standing required belief in balance, and balance was something the night had stripped from him completely, so he dragged himself across wet leaves and gravel until his palms bled and the cold burned his lungs, his eyes darting back toward the tree line as if the forest might decide to reach out again and finish what it had started. His clothes were torn, streaked with mud and sap, one boot missing, his skin mapped with scratches that would sting later when shock loosened its grip, but for now pain registered only as proof that he still existed, that he had not been fully absorbed into the dark behind him. The forest stood just as it always had at the edge of the road, indifferent in appearance, branches still, leaves heavy with dew, no sign of the violence it had contained hours earlier, and that normalcy terrified him more than the screams that still rang in his ears, because it meant there would be no obvious evidence, no spectacle to explain why only one of them had returned. He rolled onto his side and retched, bile burning. His throat, the taste sharp and humiliating, and when he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, he stared at the shaking there, the tremor that would not stop, the body remembering what the mind could not yet organize. He tried to speak, to call for help, but his voice came out as a hoarse croak, swallowed by the early morning air, and he laughed weakly at the sound, a broken thing that dissolved into coughing, because even his own voice felt foreign now. When he finally forced himself upright, knees locking, spine screaming, the world swayed violently, trees bending, sky tilting, and he clutched at nothing, convinced for a heartbeat that the ground would open and claim him too. It did not, and that small mercy felt undeserved, heavy with implication, as if survival itself were an accusation. He took a step away from the forest, then another, each movement deliberate, cautious, like someone learning to walk after a long illness, and with every step the night replayed itself in fragments, flashes without order, a missing light, a scream cut short, shadows that moved with purpose, the girl's face emerging from the dark, not as prey, but as presence. He flinched at that memory, shame and terror colliding in his chest, because it shattered the story he had been telling himself all his life about who he was and what the world allowed him to do. The road stretched ahead, empty and pale, and he followed it blindly, leaving a trail of damp footprints that would fade as the sun climbed, his mind cycling between numbness and sharp, stabbing clarity. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never be able to explain what had happened, not to the police who would later ask their questions, not to the families who would demand answers, not even to himself, because explanation required causality, and the night had operated on something older than cause and effect. When a truck finally appeared in the distance, its engine a low growl that felt impossibly loud in the quiet morning, he froze, panic spiking as he considered running, hiding, returning to the forest despite everything, but exhaustion pinned him in place, and he raised a trembling hand instead, thumb out, the universal gesture suddenly fraught with meaning. The driver slowed, suspicion etched into his face as he took in the sight of a man who looked like he had crawled out of the earth itself, and when he asked what had happened, the survivor opened his mouth, and found that the truth jammed there, too large, too heavy. So he said nothing at first, then muttered something about getting lost, about an accident, words that fell flat even to his own ears. The driver studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, because Dawn teaches people to accept half answers, and helped him into the passenger seat, the warmth of the cab shocking against his chilled skin. As the truck pulled away, the survivor stared out the window at the receding tree line, waiting for something to move, for branches to part, for proof that the forest was watching him go. But the woods remained still, and that stillness felt like a sentence being concluded. Hours later, when the sun was fully up and the world resumed its routines, the girl emerged onto a different road miles away, her steps slow but steady, her eyes hollow with fatigue yet clear, carrying within her a truth she would never fully share. She flagged down help too, and when questions came, she answered carefully, offering enough to be believed without opening the door to disbelief. And the authorities searched the forest with dogs and teams and maps, finding nothing that made sense, nothing that fit the stories they wanted to tell. The survivor watched the news from a hospital bed, bandages wrapping his hands, doctors ucking over dehydration and shock. And every time the forest was mentioned, his heart stuttered, his palms sweating despite the cool sheets. He tried to sleep, and dreamed of roots curling around his ankles, of light flickering out, of the girl standing calmly as the darkness moved, and he woke gasping, sheets twisted, the smell of antiseptic replaced by the memory of wet earth. Days passed, then weeks, and he was released back into a life that no longer fit him, his old routines chafing like ill-fitting clothes, laughter from others sounding sharp and wrong. People asked what it was like, what really happened out there, and he gave them fragments, safe pieces that avoided the core, and they nodded, satisfied enough, because people prefer explanations that do not implicate the world itself. At night he drove without destination, avoiding the area near the forest, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles ached, because stillness invited memory, and memory invited the truth he could not face. The girl moved on too, leaving the town, the state, the name she had used, carrying forward a quiet resilience that did not announce itself, and sometimes, when she passed through wooded places, she felt the echo of that night like a low hum under her skin, not fear but awareness, a reminder to listen. She dreamed less as time went on, but when she did, the dreams were not of being chased, but of walking unafraid beneath tall trees, the forest breathing around her, alive and present. The survivor tried therapy, medication, distraction, anything that promised distance from the images, but the truth did not fade. It settled, becoming part of the architecture of his mind, shaping the way he saw power, the way he flinched at cruelty even in small forms, the way he avoided groups of men laughing too loudly in the dark. He never returned to the forest, not even to stand at its edge. In daylight, because he understood that survival had come with a condition, unspoken but absolute, that he would carry the memory as a warning rather than a trophy. Sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, he thought he felt the forest again, not as threat but as presence, patient and vast, and he would whisper apologies into the dark, unsure who they were for, unsure whether they mattered. Dawn continued to arrive each day, ordinary and indifferent, and life continued to ask him to participate, to move forward, to pretend continuity where there was rupture, and he did, haltingly, imperfectly, knowing that the night would never fully release him. Somewhere far away, the forest stood, roots deep, branches wide, holding what it had taken and what it had taught, unchanged by the telling and retelling of human stories, waiting not for vengeance or gratitude, but for the next intention to cross its threshold, because places remember, and memory, once awakened, does not sleep again.